William Becker, or Bill, is a senior associate at two think tanks that focus on energy, climate change, and sustainable development issues. London-based E3G and Colorado-based Natural Capitalism Solutions. At E3G, Bill specializes in the role of energy and climate change and national security. At Natural Capitalism, he specializes in sustainable community development. He also leads The Future We Want, which uses advanced communications technologies to help the public envision what life would be like in a sustainable, clean energy society. And it's a really neat website if you have a chance to go look at that. He's a member of Mikhail Gorbachev's International Climate Change Task Force. He was also executive director of the Presidential Climate Change Action, an initiative to develop recommendations on how the President of the United States can use his current authorities to work on global climate change. He's also served for 17 years as a senior official at the U.S. Small Business Administration and the Department of Energy. He's an internationally respected expert on sustainable community development as well as climate and energy policy. And he's worked with more than 150 international communities to help them implement sustainable development principles, namely the Lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans and after the tsunami in Thailand as well. He has copies of his most recent book here today. It's called The 100-Day Action Plan to Save the Planet. Please welcome Bill Becker.
And I'm only 29 years old, so you can tell I've been very busy. Thank you, Kathy, very much, and thank you all for inviting me to be here. This is one of those communities, when I visit, I want to go back to Golden, Colorado, sell my home, and move in. And do I say that to flatter you? Yes, of course I do. But it's absolutely true. The work that all of you do, and the city does, the larger community of Fort Collins does, is just exemplary. And I think you're going to see that in this slide presentation. What I'm going to do is zoom us, after those wonderful grassroots examples of action, zoom us up to 30,000 feet to take a look at what's going on nationally and internationally that affirms what you're doing locally here in Fort Collins. And I want to warn you that my style and the time both are conspiring to make this a subliminal slideshow, which means you won't even have time to read these, but you'll probably dream about them tonight. But I am assured that they will appear on the website, wherever these presentations will, and so you'll be able to capture whatever you want to there. I'm going to cover two major topics. The first is why communities and businesses must lead us to the future, and by us I mean the country and the world. And I'm going to talk about that in the context of four different topics here: global climate change, resilience and adaptation, economic recovery, and national security. And secondly, I'm going to offer some different ways to think about sustainability. You might reject them, you might like them, but I'm just going to throw out a few different ways of thinking about this topic. So on the first topic of why communities and businesses must lead, it's pretty evident that we're at a crossroads worldwide and nationally in picking the kind of future we want. One of them is business as usual, although I don't believe business as usual actually exists, because no matter what happens, things are going to change quite a bit. And the other is a far more sustainable and higher quality of life and equitable society worldwide. Things have changed since I started in this field 30 years ago or something, changed quite a bit. One is that the evidence of interconnection between all of us on the planet has never been stronger. When one economy sneezes, the rest of the world catches cold. When there's an epidemic in one country, it tends to migrate very rapidly through the world. This map, in fact, is avian flu and how widespread it was in 2009. And environmental damage has changed. Back in the days I was growing up, one of the incidents that motivated the environmental movement was the burning of the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland. It woke people up to the fact that we had some serious work to do, and shortly after that, the Clean Water Act passed, and we held our first Earth Day. Today, though, every community's pollution, in fact, every household's pollution, and every car owner's pollution has worldwide consequences. They may be minute, but it's the aggregation of the millions and millions of decisions we all make collectively every day that results in global climate change. Now, our situation right now is one that does recommend leadership at the local level. We have nations deadlocked on this issue of climate change, as we saw in the Copenhagen negotiation a couple of years ago, and ever since. There's just no treaty in the works right now. The government at all levels is out of money right now. We have jobs moving overseas, and you could read on down this list. But the key thing is that we have a dysfunctional Congress at the moment and leaders who I think are afraid to lead. When was the last time we heard a president say, ask not what you can do, what the country can do for you, but what you can do for the country? We don't hear leaders rallying us to tackle these problems, or admitting when we need tax reform, or asking us to support our military by doing things in our homes. So there's a dearth of leadership, and it's trickling down that responsibility to local governments and state governments. This, I think, is a perfect assessment of where U.S. policy is today. I think we have exhausted all other possibilities, and it's really time to do the right thing. And I think I'll try to imply what the right thing is in some of these slides. So overall, the buck is stopping with communities around the country. These, of course, are in Colorado, but all around the world, in fact, action is trickled down, the need for action is trickled down to the local level. Now, communities have led on climate change for a lot of years, but the burden is even higher today because of the inability of our leaders to lead at the national and international levels. A little bit more about climate change. This, for all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this, but this is what the fuss is about. This is the atmosphere. Carl Sagan compared it to a layer of varnish on a basketball in terms of proportionality. It's a sensitive membrane around our planet that's being affected by what we do. It's also the perfect problem, as Harvard or Yale University said, because it has so many dimensions that are difficult to understand, that are difficult to take responsibility for. It seems like the problem's too big. It seems that the consequences will be a couple generations down the road. We count on technology to save us from the consequences. It may be God's plan that we go through this kind of change. And frankly, it's too depressing for some people to think about, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the proof is positive. We've seen evidence that's incontrovertible, that climate change is underway. I don't know what the argument is about. Now, one of the things that's happening here is that while politics is the art of compromise, the atmosphere is not negotiating about this issue. This is science. This is happening as a result of physics and other laws of nature. And so it's not, the atmosphere is not negotiating. Partial solutions won't really get us to where we need to be if we want to maintain a high quality of life. The other thing I want to point out is that the divisions we see between the political parties in DC are not necessarily reflected at the community level. And this is a poll that was taken last April by the Yale Project on Climate Change Communications that shows there's fairly widespread agreement that climate change is real. People begin to start to disagree on why climate change is underway, but more and more Americans, contrary to the press reports you see, are in agreement that this is real across the political spectrum until you get to the Tea Party. Also, this survey asked people how important they thought climate change was in protecting their communities in each of these areas. And you see a very, very large majority of people saying, yes, it's important to do the kinds of things that you're doing here in Fort Collins to protect us from the consequences of climate change. But the real unusual thing about this issue to me is you don't have to believe it's real to believe in its solutions, because the same things we need to do for climate change are the things we need to do for many other reasons, including energy independence, public health, national security, and I'll show you more about that in a while, on down the list. So action that we can promote in our communities to address many other issues will actually end up addressing climate change, so we needn't argue about it. It's all about managing risk. And if you think of climate change as a risk management issue, all you have to decide is that it's possible the scientists are correct. Not that they're absolutely correct, but it's possible. And we manage risk against possibilities in our lives every day with auto insurance, hazard insurance, liability insurance, and so on. So we're used to that. And that's exactly at an international scale what climate change is all about. Now, how are communities addressing this issue? As of yesterday, the day before, more than 1,000 cities have signed the Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. Fort Collins signed it years ago, pledging to achieve 7% cuts in their greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a pretty impressive record until you realize that there are more than 20,000 communities in the United States. So this is just a fraction. And are they carrying out their pledges? This is a survey that was taken by the International City County Managers Association last year that shows a very small minority of communities have established a formal sustainability policy, have established a baseline for their greenhouse gas emissions, have set targets, firm targets at different sectors in the community for reducing those emissions. Now, there may be polls that show a more optimistic front, and I'd like to see them, but this is one indicator that many, many more communities need to hear your story and need to begin taking the kind of action that Fort Collins has taken. Moving on to resilience and adaptation, I was delighted to see the sign out there from the utility, Fort Collins Utility, about this topic, how we protect ourselves against the consequences of extreme weather events. This too is trickling down to become a local responsibility. Worldwide, this is the record we've seen last year in the number of disasters and their cost. Over the past decade, international disasters, weather-related disasters have been on the increase. And these have national security implications. We're not isolated from the consequences of these. This is a scene from Pakistan about a year ago, when they had their record floods that covered much of the country. And there was a danger there at the beginning of this disaster when the religious extremists in the country began delivering assistance faster than the government. There was a danger for a moment that this nuclear state would be taken over by those religious extremists. And that is a scary proposition. So the kinds of impacts we're seeing internationally have a very much effect on us here in the United States. East Africa, as you've seen on the news, is experiencing the worst drought in 60 years. 11 million people are affected. 800,000 children are at risk of dying from malnutrition, a consequence of climate change. This is a consequence of drought. So we need to deal locally to help mitigate these problems internationally. Here in the United States, we have had $10 billion disasters this year so far. Over the last 30 years, the average has been 3 per year. So we can see that there's a great increase in the intensity and the frequency of these big natural disaster events. And one of the consequences of this is that our national flood insurance program, because private insurers won't insure floodplain properties, is broke. It's $18 billion in debt right now, and Congress is trying to figure out how to reform this program so that people who live and work in floodplains can be insured. The insurance industry is beginning to recognize the liability of climate change or extreme weather, however it might be caused. Allstate is the largest home and car insurance company in the country. Its business model now is the assumption that these extreme weather events will be a permanent pattern, not an aberration over the past couple of years. Now, why can't we rely on the federal government to protect us from this kind of weather? As I mentioned, those events are increasing. At the same time, the infrastructure to protect us is aging. We have 85,000 dams. The average age of those dams is 51 years old. 80 to 90% of them are owned and supposed to be maintained by local governments or private landowners who have deferred maintenance, so many of them are unsafe these days. We have 100,000 miles of levees in this country in the same condition, much of it. We're finding that structures like that really don't solve the problem. They save lives often, but they also encourage people to live in floodplains. And when those levees are breached or dams fail, more people, more property is damaged than if they had never built those structures. And the governments are broke. I think we're at the end of the large public works era in this country. And so I wanted to show how some communities are taking action. This is the NOAA capsule that's been invented by a company in Japan in case they ever have another tsunami, which I think is interesting, but innovative certainly. But more serious measures may be on this list of the local actions that communities can take. And the biggest one I would point to is the restoration of ecosystem services. Because over the years, we've tended to degrade, if not destroy, wetlands, the meander of rivers, the vegetative covering on watersheds, and so on. And they provided a level of protection for us for free. And we need to restore those ecosystem services so that we get that protection back and mitigate at least much of the danger of these disasters. And we can control that locally, and we probably can afford those kinds of actions locally. In the area of economic recovery, I want to address this very quickly, even though this is high on everyone's priority list, and point out that I think that the definition of a good business climate is changing these days. I think much of the stuff we have to do to be more resilient, to be more safe, to be more secure, all now factors into where businesses plan to locate. And Kathy mentioned earlier the rankings you've received. Here are some others where you can see that different, very visible organizations are beginning to grade our communities based on how climate ready they are, how sustainable they are, and this grades both states and communities. This is Siemens on the left and Site Selection Magazine for where people locate businesses on the right. And of course, what Kathy mentioned about your community. So it's very important to do what you're doing from an economic development standpoint. But I want to point out this strategy for locally controlling your economic climate. And this is one that Rocky Mountain Institute developed years and years ago. While many communities are chasing after plants to come and locate in their areas, that really is a lottery approach to business and job development. The first thing to do is to plug the leaks in your community. In a typical community, in a typical house, in a typical car, there's a hemorrhaging of dollars as energy is wasted. In this country, we waste 87% of the energy we consume. That's an amazing and depressing record. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here. And you can find out without much effort, if you haven't already, where these leaks are in your community. And if you plug them, those dollars, instead of leaving right away, will resonate and bounce around in the community and create a multiplier effect that may be $1, $2, $5, $6 of advantage for every dollar you retain in the economy. So that's number one. Number two is to nurture all of you, the businesses that are already here in Fort Collins. How can you improve your business climate to help you expand and grow and stay in business, actually? And number three is to find new value-added opportunities for new businesses in Fort Collins, whether it's new enterprises in your business or whether it's whole new businesses. It's likely there are opportunities for value-added activities laying around. And then, and only then, you look at the recruitment of outside companies. On national security, it may seem odd that national security is a community responsibility. But there's new thinking going on in the defense community these days that national security isn't just a matter of maintaining military forces and containing foreign threats. It's a matter of the fabric of our society, how strong we are as communities, how resilient we are. And so the military is beginning to turn toward that thought. And regarding homeland security is sustainability, actually, in each of our communities. And we're finding climate change and sustainability recognized in all of the military's official documents, the Quadrennial Defense Review, the Army Field Manual, these documents that I show on this slide. And some of the forward thinkers in the military are pointing out that in this day and age, a solar collector is almost as important as an M16 rifle. And an electric vehicle is important as a tank. I mean, these are tools of national security. We need to invest in them because they improve our security. This is another document, another thinker, Colonel Mark Bickleby, who until last February was a senior advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying essentially the same thing. So at very high levels, the idea of sustainability as security is now there. And this isn't a new thought, it's just that more thinkers are thinking it. I wrote about this 30 years ago, and I don't expect you to read all this, but it's the idea that security is the coherence of our communities. And before we think about investments in military, which we need, before we think about that as our primary source of security, we need to take care of people, social equity, environment, business, and so on. The Army, oddly, is leading the country in renewable energy development right now. It is the leader. And their theory is not for the environment, their theory is the green warrior. And they're finding that renewable technologies and energy efficiency increase their effectiveness as a fighting force, reduce their costs. Fuel for operations in Afghanistan, for example, often costs $400 a gallon by the time it reaches the front lines. There have been 3,000 soldiers and civilians in the past, 2003 to 2007, killed protecting fuel convoys. It's the most vulnerable part of military operations. So the military, for very practical defense reasons, is adopting these technologies in a very big way. Here's a chart that shows their projected spending of the Department of Defense between now and 2030. And these are opportunities for innovation. There's no doubt about it. And the military is a big enough a procurement force that it might change the economy. It might create a sustained, sizable market for new products that are renewable and efficient. The president has weighed in. He's issued an executive order on sustainability. He did that in October 2009. Another big consumer, actually, the federal government. It's 8,600 buildings in 2,200 communities, 217,000 non-military vehicles. This also can change the market, this kind of theory of procurement. And this is the most interesting part of the president's executive order. He's ordered federal agencies, including military bases, to collaborate with communities to help them reach their sustainability goals. South of here at Fort Carson, it is one of 2 Army bases that has been ordered to achieve net zero water, net zero energy, and net zero waste by 2020. And there's a great collaboration waiting to happen there. With the big federal campus in Denver, the second largest in the country, this kind of partnership between the military, civilian, federal, local is waiting to happen. Now, I want to get into this different ways of thinking about sustainability. This is the close of the presentation, actually. I think that we need to frame these issues a little bit differently and think about the solutions differently. You've all seen this Einstein quote, that we need to change how we think before we can change how we behave. The first I mentioned earlier, business as usual doesn't exist. We keep talking about what will happen if we maintain current behavior. We will not be able to maintain current behavior because the world is going to change in significant ways if we do nothing. And it will change in significant ways if we do something. So let's stop talking about business as usual. Sustainability is not as it used to be when the Brundtland Commission first defined it in 1987 about meeting our needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. It's become a much more profound need now because our problems have become much more profound. And sustainability, what we're calling full spectrum sustainability, requires that we change our mindset, get rid of the myth of separation that we are superior to and separate from the biosphere in which we live, and understand that we're part of that and begin to collaborate with nature than trying to control it. Thoughts like those are what we need to get to full spectrum sustainability. As kids, we all heard there were limits and consequences in our lives, but you know what? That's not part of the American DNA. You know, our first impression of this country was limitless resources, limitless space, limitless opportunity, and it's really hard to tell someone not to drive an SUV in this country because we believe it's our God-given right to do that. Well, we need to understand that because of population shown in this chart here, because of the massive increase in our technology and our impact on the environment, or the potential impact, this shows a plow, the old style, horse-driven plow, and down below, one of these house-sized earth movers that's taking the tops off of mountains in Appalachia right now. We have a much greater ability and a much bigger footprint, so we need to be more careful than ever. It used to be the environment could absorb what we did. That's no longer the case. We think of sustainable development as balancing environment, equity, economy. It's not. It's about optimizing all three. Because when we think of balance, we're taking something away from over here, and we're putting it over here, and we're moving this over here. We're not diminishing any one of these three. That should not be our goal. It's not to take away from any of them. We need to figure out how to optimize all three of these aspects of sustainability. There's a difference between problem solving and problem switching. We find all kinds of single-purpose solutions out there that really cause more problems than they solve. I'll give you an example. Liquids from coal, or oil from shale, or gas from tar sands may be great for energy independence. They're terrible for water. They're terrible for carbon. They're terrible for energy intensity. So by picking those solutions to foreign oil imports, we're signing up for a whole another slew of problems that I think will be worse than our dependence today on foreign oil. There's this idea that because coal is in the ground and there's a lot of it and it's going to last forever, and there are other resources in the same category, we are going to use it, and we're going to use it for a long time to come. But there was an Arab oil minister many years ago who said, as he was talking about the vulnerability of the oil industry, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. And the coal and oil ages are not going to end because we run out of those resources. They're going to end because we find a better way to do business. So let's don't assume that because it exists, we have to consume it. The ultimate power plant, if our criteria are lots of supply for a long time at low cost, then there's no better power plant than this one right here. There's no cost. We've got a 7 billion year supply. We get the stuff in 8 minutes from the time it's created, over 3 million miles, and it has 0 carbon emissions. So why are we fiddling with the other kind of power production? I don't know. Smart technologies can only go so far to accommodate stupid behavior. This is the technical salvation idea. Right now, geoengineering is a big topic, and there are some very good forms of geoengineering, and there's some very crazy forms of geoengineering. And the one I love the best is the idea of deploying mirrors in space to reflect the sunlight. What we're not thinking about is the fact that that space junk up there may break those mirrors and cause us 7 years of bad luck every time that happens. We have to change our behavior, not just our technologies. If we insist on ruining the planet, we have to stop calling ourselves the most intelligent species. We don't deserve the title anymore. Incrementalism is not what we need. We need radical, transformative change. This is a quote from Sam Walton. It's true for our country as it was for his company. We need transformative, radical change. Now, there's a phenomenon out there called apocalypse fatigue, and that is the apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic movies we see like The 11th Hour and The Inconvenient Truth and The Road and on and on and on, have a disabling effect, a debilitating effect. They can depress people, they can make the problems seem inevitable. And it's very important for us to know the consequences of what we do if we keep doing this, but it's also important to know what we can create if we put our shoulders to it. There's power in negative thinking, there's power in positive thinking, And as this quote says, we have not yet begun to unleash the power of positive thinking. So I'm involved in a project to try to unleash that power. Kathy mentioned it, the future we want. Let me show you one very crude vision of this kind of society. Now, I'm not hooked up to sound. There's a pretty little song that goes behind this, and I'm not going to sing it for you. But this is a colleague of mine, Jonathan Arnold, who's involved in this project with me, lives in Kansas City, and he does these kinds of computer animations of what will happen, in this case in Kansas City, if they add mass transit and urban development begins to cluster around the mass transit stations. And this helps people actually, those who don't engage in the mental policy argument very much, begin to see and viscerally understand what sustainability can mean. In this picture, Jonathan has created a computer animation of light rail and combined it with actual video of people. I'll get there in a minute. He's showing some other stuff right now. But with actual people on sidewalks. So the vision of the future is populated with real people. Here it is right here. I'll let this run for a couple of seconds more and then I'll cut it off. This is done by Arup, the British development firm, showing algae production and solar production on the side of high-rise buildings. And as I say, this is very crude technology. So there are much more advanced ways to show this. This is an actress that Jonathan hired to walk into a computer-generated high-density urban development to show prospective customers what they look like and how pleasant they are. Jonathan has raised more than $6 billion in capital for urban developers using these kinds of visualization technologies. And everything you see here is phony, except her. All right, I'm going to cut it off there. In the interest of time, a couple of messages I want to leave you with. And one is that we're all in this together. We got to move out of our stovepipes and not think that it's someone else's responsibility. It's a problem we all need to work on as communities. We need a little less pluribus and a little more unum. I think we all can agree with that. Local leadership is now critical to environmental, economic, and national security. It's not a job we can farm out to our soldiers anymore. We have to help them at the local level. A secure world requires secure nations. Secure nations require secure communities. We need to recognize the risks of so-called business as usual, but also the opportunities of transformative change. If you want to be wealthy, plug your leaks wherever you're using energy. Business as usual doesn't exist. I've beat that one to death. And inspire other communities, because not that many of them, sadly, are doing the kind of thing you're doing. So get your story out. I'll help get your story out. Others need to learn from your example, and it's really quite a spectacular example. The message I want to leave you with is the future is still in our hands, and you're all helping us get there in the right way. Thank you very much for listening. Gentleman's question, I have to repeat them for the sake of the cameraman back there, is that change requires a top-down mandate approach, that government has to lead on this. Is that a fair, quick summary? And I agree, that is a common theme. And in the environmental community, of course, all of our eggs were put in the basket of a cap-and-trade bill in Congress. And we deployed all the lobbyists we could find and did all the tricks we knew how to do in terms of winning votes on the Hill. Success was measured by votes on the Hill, and we failed. And right now you've got foundations who traditionally fund environmental organizations wondering where their money should go next because they don't trust the congressional strategy anymore. Now, my view of command and control versus bottom-up is that you need both. I think we can do things faster and more efficiently through regulation, oftentimes, through a cap or a price on carbon in whatever form it takes, will drive the market and can be a game changer, but that's not all that has to happen. We have a society, a governmental system, a system of regulations, an economy that's developed over 200 years of carbon use. And so there's so many things that have to change in this economy. Some can be driven by a command or a control or a regulation. Others have to be driven by behavior changes, by willingly adopting new technologies. So I think it has to come from both directions. And in fact, when localities move out on this, they empower or make braver the federal officials to pass that kind of legislation. Everybody pretends on the Hill to speak for the American public. These polls show they're not speaking for the American public. And when they see that, I think they'll be emboldened, if not required, to begin to vote for the kinds of things the American people value. Now, I sound like I'm speaking for the American people, but what I'm saying is that there's a bottom-up force that has to occur to push for action and courage on the part of our politicians. It's both, to me, coming from both directions, local and federal. The question is how we battle the propaganda that's funded by the deep pockets of corporations. And of course, that's the topic of Occupy Wall Street right now. Because it does seem as though there's incredible influence being exerted by traditional industries who want to keep the status quo. I think that's true, and you can see it in campaign finance reports and so on. I think one Once again, through example is one way to chip away at that influence. I think nature is going to conspire to chip away at that influence. I think the kinds of weather events we're seeing now will continue. I think people will begin to accept that they're related to climate, that they need to use different forms of energy. Every one of the economic recessions we've experienced since World War II, except one, was preceded by a spike in oil prices. At some point, people are going to hear that economic security requires that we move to different indigenous, clean sources of energy. And on and on and on. I think we need to keep making the case. We need, by example, to show that these new technologies are preferable and they work quite well. And we need political action, frankly, like the kind we're seeing on the streets right now. I'm a baby of the Vietnam era, and I went off to Vietnam and then came back to watch the war at home as a newspaperman. Boy, I'll tell you, if we had a draft today, we would be seeing demonstrations like that today. But we don't. But we're being drafted into another era, into another set of conditions that really aren't going to be that fun. And as people begin to understand that, I think we're going to see the tide turn a little bit. I hope so. The other thing we need to do is make the case for why oil companies, coal companies, gas companies, and others can profit from this stuff, how their future lies in helping us in this transition. There was a little bit of a revolution that started at Exxon a couple of years ago when members of the Rockefeller family introduced a resolution at the stockholders meeting to unseat the CEO because Exxon was not, they said, investing enough money in the technologies of the future. They were putting their eggs in the basket of the technologies that are going to go away, in the resources. And that was defeated, but there's something happening there. The other thing that's happening is transparency, that companies are having a harder time now hiding their liabilities related to climate change. The SEC 2 years ago put out some pretty firm guidance for publicly traded companies to every year report their climate risks. That could be emerging science, emerging weather, emerging technologies, emerging legislation and regulation, but they have to make those risks transparent. My hope is that investors and stockholders, as they understand the risks, will hold the companies more accountable for mitigating those risks. And in part, that means using these kinds of technologies, the clean technologies. So I don't know of a silver bullet for changing the embedded power of corporations. But I think as long as they wield their influence, we're going to have more and more cognitive dissonance until we understand as a culture that we need to change. That's my hope. And I hope it happens before I die, too, I should say. Working a long time on this. Yes, sir, way in the back. So the question has to do with it. There were worries about cap and trade as a market changer, a game changer toward clean energy technologies because of the money changer aspect. And the cap and trade bill that finally emerged with any possibility of passage on the Hill was a result of the political compromise instead of the scientific reality. And it was a Rube Goldberg contraption that tried to satisfy every sector and not make any sector pay too much pain. And that's the legislative process, and God bless him for coming up with that legislation. But there are much simpler ways to put a price on carbon if we really want to do that. But there's other things as well. One is the subsidy system, and I'm going to reveal my biases if I haven't already. But we've been subsidizing oil for the past 100 years. Nuclear power has never lived off the public dole since it was invented in the 50s. It's always been subsidized by the state. And there's a justification for subsidizing for a time renewable energy and energy efficiency, particularly those technologies that are too young to thrive in the marketplace, that need to get across the valley of death. They are in the national interest. And in my book, public subsidies are justified for a time when a technology or behavior is clearly in the national interest. So I believe that the president's right. I'd be more aggressive than him in reducing, if not eliminating, subsidies for oil companies, especially the ones they don't really need to produce oil. And for other fossil energy technologies that have been around for quite a while, whose industries are very rich and well able to take care of themselves. I don't believe the federal government should subsidize clean coal and carbon sequestration because the coal industry should be doing that research for its own future. And on and on and on. So changing the subsidy structure, the incentive structure, we need to move to a culture that's rewarding what we want to happen and not rewarding the things we don't want to happen. And that subsidy is going to be a big discussion in the months to come in terms of the super committee on the Hill and how we're going to deal with the deficit and all of that. You know, 6 other answers popped into mind as you were speaking, and they've all escaped me. But there are other ways than carbon pricing to do this. Oh, the other is what I mentioned in my talk. Industry, I think, is waiting for sizable, sustained markets in order to make the investment in plant and equipment, produce these technologies at scale. When they produce them at scale, the price will go down, they'll become more competitive. So the government's commitment to buy these technologies, the military's commitment to buy these technologies can provide that market if Congress doesn't take away the money for them to do that, right? So that's a solution we should be fighting for, I think. Any other questions? Yes, sir. The question is, how does nuclear fit into the picture? A lot of countries use it very safely, but we've been on hold for a long time in this economy. A lot of people in the environmental community who I never would have expected 2 or 3 years ago to support nuclear power now do, because they feel the urgency of the climate issue. They feel the urgency to dramatically reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And nuclear is a virtually carbon-free fuel at the point of generation. There is some carbon implied in its life cycle. Our position in the Presidential Climate Action Project, when we were making recommendations for the candidates in 2008 and eventually Obama, was that nuclear power is okay, but first you have to figure out how to deal with the wastes. You have to figure out how to get it off the taxpayers' back. You have to figure out how to harden the plants from possible terrorist attack, and you have to come up with an international regime to prevent proliferation of nuclear materials. So the burden should be on those fronts to make nuclear energy a desirable option for us. That's another example, possibly, of problem switching rather than problem solving, if, for the sake of reducing carbon emissions, we propagate those other problems. And some people consider those wastes a form of terrorism against future generations. Well, I don't know, but I think we need to solve the downsides of that technology before we employ it in a big way. There's work going on, by the way, on little scale nuclear technology that you may have heard of for a community, for example, or a business complex. We'll see where that goes, but yeah. It may have a role, but first it's got to clear up some of the mess, it seems to me. Okay, other questions? Oh, here's one that I got in writing, by the way. I almost forgot. Your book advises the president to make changes without involving Congress. What progress has been made? Yeah, the premise of our project, which began in 2007, to come up with policy recommendations for the president, started with a very comprehensive study we did. We commissioned the University of Colorado Boulder Law School to study executive authority. And we had 2 very authoritative studies come out about what the president could do without Congress. It's a dicey question in many ways, because Congress can get mad and start to revoke his authorities. But we listed all the things he could do. We produced more than 200 recommendations for what he could do, way down deep in the bureaucracy, way up high in public view. And we did a cross-check last January at the midpoint of his first term, and found that much of what he's done, probably 150 different things, coincides loosely with what we recommended. In other words, he may have done not exactly the target we recommended, because we were very aggressive, but the policy that in principle has been implemented under executive authority. There's a lot more he could do, though, and he hasn't done the big things. He hasn't set a really aggressive carbon reduction goal for the United States. It's only the equivalent of about 3% by 2020 compared to the science people who tell us we need to achieve much, much higher than that. He hasn't put his weight behind carbon pricing, but he has done some historic things. The auto efficiency standards that he's implementing are truly historic and will make a big difference. And he's done much else, like his sustainability executive order and supporting the military's mobilization of renewable technologies. So we're pretty happy with how much he has implemented based on what we recommended. Our plan was termed by John Podesta, who was the co-chairman of his transition committee, as the gold standard for policy input to the president on energy and climate. So we were very pleased with the feedback we got. And he's used a lot of it, but he still hasn't done the big things. All right, you guys, thanks very much again.